The blood staining her skirts was the first thing Preston Xavier noticed when he found her crumpled in the mud outside the saloon, and his heart stopped cold in his chest when he saw her hands clutching her swollen belly. The storm had rolled into Abilene, Texas with a vengeance that September evening in 1878, turning the dusty streets into rivers of mud and sending most folks scrambling for shelter. Preston had been checking on his horse in the livery stable when he heard the commotion from the saloon, men's voices raised in anger, then a woman's scream cut short. By the time he pushed through the doors into the rain, the cowards had already fled, leaving her there alone in the dirt. She was maybe 20 years old, her dark hair plastered to her pale face, consciousness flickering behind her eyelids. Preston dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering uncertainly before he gently touched her shoulder. "Madam, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened, brown and filled with pain and fear. "My baby," she whispered, and fresh tears mixed with the rain on her cheeks. "Please, my baby." Preston did not hesitate. He slipped one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her shoulders, lifting her as carefully as he could manage. She was light despite her condition, and he could feel her trembling against his chest as he turned toward the only place he knew might help. Doc Morrison's house was 3 blocks away, and Preston walked through that storm like he was carrying the most precious cargo in the world, shielding her face from the driving rain with his shoulder, murmuring reassurances he was not sure he believed. "What happened?" he asked gently as he navigated around a deep puddle. "My husband," she gasped out, then winced. "He was drunk, started accusing me of things that were not true. When I tried to leave, he kicked me. Then his friends threw me out into the street." Preston's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "You are safe now. I promise you, I will not let anything else happen to you." She looked up at him then, really looked at him, and something passed between them in that moment, some recognition that neither could name. "Why are you helping me? You do not even know me." "My mother raised me to believe that when someone needs help, you give it, no questions asked." He adjusted his grip slightly, pulling her closer as the wind picked up. "What is your name?" "Fiona," she said softly. "Fiona Chambers, Preston Xavier. And I am going to get you to the doctor, Fiona. Just hold on." Doc Morrison was a gruff man in his 60s who had seen everything the frontier could throw at a person, but even he looked concerned when Preston carried Fiona through his door. His wife, Martha, immediately took charge, ushering them into the examination room and helping Preston lay Fiona on the narrow bed. "Out," Martha said firmly to Preston, but Fiona's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "Please stay," she said, her eyes wide with terror. "Please do not leave me alone." Preston looked at Doc Morrison, who shrugged. "If it gives her comfort, he can stay. But you," he pointed at Preston, "stand over there by the door and do not get in my way." The next hour was the longest of Preston's life. He stood with his back against the wall, his wet clothes dripping onto the floor, watching as the doctor examined Fiona while Martha held her hand and spoke soothing words. Fiona cried out several times, and each sound felt like a knife twisting in Preston's gut. He barely knew this woman, but the fierce protectiveness he felt toward her was undeniable. Finally, Doc Morrison straightened and wiped his hands on a cloth. His expression was serious but not grave. "The bleeding has stopped. The baby's heartbeat is strong, and I believe both mother and child will be fine, but she needs complete rest for at least a week, maybe 2. No stress, no walking around, nothing that could cause more trauma." Fiona's sob of relief echoed through the small room, and Preston found himself breathing properly for the first time since he had found her in the mud. "Where is your husband?" Doc Morrison asked, his tone making it clear he had some choice words for the man. "I do not know and I do not care," Fiona said, her voice stronger now despite her exhaustion. "I will never go back to him. I would rather die in the street than spend another moment under his roof." Martha exchanged a meaningful look with her husband. "You cannot go anywhere in this condition, dear. You will stay here tonight at least." "I cannot pay you," Fiona said quietly, shame coloring her cheeks. "My husband controlled all the money." "We will figure that out later," Doc Morrison said gruffly. "Right now you need to rest." Preston pushed off from the wall. "I will pay for her care, whatever it costs." 3 pairs of eyes turned to him in surprise. Preston felt heat creep up his neck but stood his ground. "She needs help and I can provide it. I have been saving my wages from the cattle drives. The money is just sitting in the bank doing nothing." "Young man," Doc Morrison said carefully, "people will talk if you are paying for another man's wife to stay somewhere. Let them talk." Preston met Fiona's gaze across the room. "Sometimes doing the right thing matters more than what people say." Fiona's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different. "I will pay you back, every cent, I swear it." "We can discuss that when you are well," Preston said softly. "For now, just rest." He left soon after, once he was sure Fiona was settled and comfortable. The storm had passed, leaving the streets washed clean and the air smelling of rain and earth. Preston walked back to the boarding house where he rented a room, his mind churning. He should have just dropped her at the doctor's and gone on his way. He had no business getting involved in a married woman's troubles, even if her husband was the worst kind of scum. But when he closed his eyes that night, all he could see was her face, pale and frightened and brave all at once. He remembered the weight of her in his arms, the trust she had placed in him without knowing anything about him, except that he had stopped to help when no one else would. Preston had been a cowboy all his adult life, driving cattle from Texas up to Kansas, saving his money with vague plans of someday buying his own land. At 24, he figured he had plenty of time to think about settling down, about family and home and all those things that seemed distant and unimportant when you spent most of your year sleeping under stars and eating dust. But something had shifted tonight. Something fundamental had changed in the space between finding Fiona in the mud and watching her fall asleep in the doctor's spare room, her hand resting protectively over her belly. The next morning, Preston stopped by the doctor's house before heading to his job at the feed store where he worked between cattle drives. Martha answered the door with a knowing smile that made him feel transparent as glass. "She is awake and asking for you," Martha said, stepping aside to let him enter. "Asking for me?" Preston's heart did an odd skip. "You made quite an impression, young man. She has been worried that you might have caught a chill from being out in that storm." Preston found Fiona sitting up in bed, looking much better than she had the night before, though still pale and drawn. Her eyes lit up when she saw him, and he felt that strange tug in his chest again. "You came back," she said, sounding genuinely surprised. "Said I would check on you." Preston removed his hat and turned it in his hands, suddenly awkward. "How are you feeling?" "Sore, tired, but grateful to be alive." She gestured to the chair beside the bed. "Will you sit? I feel rude making you stand there." Preston sat, acutely aware of the propriety they were probably violating but unable to make himself care much. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in months," Fiona admitted. "Without fear hanging over me, without wondering if tonight would be the night he went too far." She looked down at her hands. "I know I should feel guilty for saying such things about my husband, but I cannot find it in myself to lie anymore." "Why did you marry him?" The question came out before Preston could stop it, and he immediately regretted his bluntness. "I apologize." "That is not my business." "No, it is all right." Fiona sighed. "James Chambers seemed like a good man when I met him in Austin. My parents had died of fever the year before, and I was alone and frightened. He offered security, a home, protection. I thought I was lucky." Her laugh was bitter. "He waited until after the wedding to show his true nature. By then, I was trapped. And the baby is his, yes. Though when I told him I was expecting, he accused me of infidelity. Said the child could not possibly be his because he had been away on business when I must have conceived." She shook her head. The truth was he had simply been too drunk to remember our encounters, but his pride would not let him admit that, so instead he decided I had betrayed him. Preston felt anger burn hot in his belly. "He is a coward and a fool. He is dangerous," Fiona corrected quietly. "When he realizes where I am, he will come for me. Not because he wants me, but because I am his property, and men like James do not let go of their property easily. Then we will make sure you are somewhere safe before he finds you." Preston leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Do you have anywhere you can go? Family? Friends?" Fiona shook her head. "No one. James isolated me from anyone who might have helped. We only arrived in Abilene 2 weeks ago because he heard about work here. I do not even know anyone in this town except for you and the Morrisons." The plan formed in Preston's mind almost without his conscious thought, and he knew it was crazy even as he started to speak. "I have a small house about 5 miles outside of town. Nothing fancy, just 2 rooms and a barn, but it is mine, paid in full. You could stay there while you recover. No one would think to look for you outside of town, and I could make sure you had everything you needed." Fiona stared at him. "I could not possibly impose on you like that. You have already done so much. You would not be imposing. The house sits empty most of the time anyway, since I usually sleep in the bunkhouse during cattle season. It seems foolish to let it go to waste when someone needs it. Preston." The way she said his name made something warm bloom in his chest. "Why are you doing this? Please, tell me the truth." Preston met her gaze and decided honesty was the only option. "I do not fully know. All I know is that when I found you last night, something in me recognized something in you. Like maybe we were supposed to meet exactly when and how we did. And I cannot walk away now, not when you need help and I can give it. It would feel like walking away from something important, even if I do not understand what that something is yet." Fiona's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "No one has ever been kind to me without expecting something in return. I do not expect anything. Just let me help you. Let me make sure you and your baby are safe." Preston paused. "Please." She nodded slowly, and Preston felt relief wash over him. They spent the next hour making plans. Doc Morrison agreed that moving Fiona out of town was probably wise, especially once word spread about what had happened. Martha packed a bag with supplies and gave Preston strict instructions about Fiona's care. "She needs to stay in bed as much as possible for at least another week," Martha said firmly. "Light meals, plenty of water, and absolutely no stress. If the bleeding starts again or she has severe pain, you bring her right back here, you understand?" "Yes, madam." "And Preston." Martha's voice softened. "What you are doing is good and decent. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." They waited until nightfall to move Fiona, wanting to avoid curious eyes and wagging tongues. Preston brought his wagon around to the back of the doctor's house, and he and Doc Morrison carefully helped Fiona into the back, where Martha had arranged blankets and pillows to make the ride as comfortable as possible. The journey to Preston's house took nearly an hour, and he drove as carefully as he ever had, avoiding ruts and bumps in the road. Fiona dozed in the back, exhausted from even that small amount of exertion. The moon was high and bright, turning the landscape silver and strange. Preston's house was modest but sturdy, built of wood with a small covered porch. He had bought the land 2 years ago with money saved from a particularly good cattle drive, planning to eventually expand and maybe start his own ranch. But for now, it was just him and the house and a barn that currently sheltered his horse and a milk cow. He lit a lamp inside, revealing the main room with its simple furniture and the bedroom beyond. The place was clean but sparse, clearly the home of a man who spent most of his time elsewhere. "I know it is not much," Preston said as he helped Fiona inside and guided her to the bedroom. "It is perfect," Fiona said, and she meant it. The bed was large and covered with a thick quilt, and the room smelled faintly of pine and leather. Most importantly, it felt safe. "Thank you, Preston, for everything." "I will sleep out in the main room," Preston said, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the situation. "If you need anything during the night, just call out. I am a light sleeper." The first few days fell into an easy rhythm. Preston worked at the feed store during the day while Fiona rested, and in the evenings he would cook simple meals that they shared at the small table. Fiona was not allowed to help despite her protests, so instead she would sit and talk with him, telling him about her childhood in Austin, about her parents who had been kind and loving, about her dreams before James Chambers had entered her life. In turn, Preston told her about growing up on a small farm in eastern Texas, about losing his father to a horse accident when he was 16 and his mother to pneumonia 2 years later. He talked about the freedom he found on the cattle drives, the camaraderie with the other cowboys, the satisfaction of hard work and starry skies. "You get lonely?" Fiona asked one evening as Preston washed dishes. He considered the question. "Sometimes. But I always figured loneliness was just part of the life I chose." "What if you could choose differently?" Preston turned to look at her, and the intensity in her gaze made his breath catch. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if you did not have to be alone? What if there was someone who wanted to share this life with you, modest as it might be?" "Fiona," Preston said carefully, "you are married. To a man who tried to kill our child, to a man who beat me and terrorized me and never showed me one moment of genuine affection." Fiona's voice was steady. "I know what the law says, Preston. I know I am legally bound to James Chambers. But in my heart, in my soul, I stopped being his wife the moment he raised his fist to me. I will not go back to him. I would rather face judgment from every person in Texas than spend another day as that man's property." Preston crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "You do not have to go back to him. I meant what I said about keeping you safe. I know you did. You are the most genuinely good man I have ever met." Fiona squeezed his hands. "But I need to know something. These feelings I am developing for you, this warmth in my chest when you walk through the door, this comfort I feel in your presence, am I alone in feeling them?" Preston's heart pounded so hard he was sure she could hear it. "No, you are not alone." They stayed like that for a long moment, hands clasped, eyes locked, the weight of confession hanging between them. Finally, Preston rose and pressed a gentle kiss to Fiona's forehead. "Rest now," he said softly. "We can figure out the rest as we go." But fate, as it often does, had other plans. 3 days later, Preston returned from town to find a horse he did not recognize tied outside his house and the front door standing open. His blood turned to ice. He entered cautiously and found a man standing in his main room, tall and broad-shouldered with a mean cast to his features and whiskey on his breath, even from across the room. "James Chambers," it had to be. "So you are the one who has been hiding my wife," James said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I am the one who saved her life after you tried to end it," Preston replied evenly, though his hand itched to reach for the pistol at his hip. "She is my wife. I can treat her as I see fit." James took a step forward. "Where is she?" "Somewhere you will never touch her again. James laughed, ugly and sharp. "You think you can keep her from me? I have the law on my side, boy. She is my legal property. She is a human being, and you do not deserve her." The punch came fast, but Preston was faster. He ducked James's fist and landed his own blow to the man's ribs, putting all his weight behind it. James staggered but recovered quickly, and suddenly they were grappling, crashing into furniture, trading blows. Preston was younger and quicker, but James was heavier and fought dirty, going for eyes and throat. They smashed through the door and out onto the porch, rolling in the dirt. Preston managed to get on top and landed 3 solid punches to James's face before the man bucked him off. "Stop!" Fiona's voice rang out, high and frightened. She stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, the other protecting her belly. "Stop it, both of you!" James seized the moment of distraction to grab a piece of firewood from beside the porch and swing it at Preston's head. Preston managed to roll away, but not fast enough. The wood caught him across the shoulder with a crack that made Fiona scream. Pain exploded through Preston's arm, but adrenaline pushed him through it. He swept James's legs out from under him, and when the man went down, Preston was on him again, pinning him, his good hand around James's throat. "You have a choice," Preston said, his voice deadly calm despite his racing heart. "You can walk away right now and never come back, or I can finish this permanently and tell the sheriff you attacked me on my own property." "You would not dare," James choked out, but there was fear in his eyes now. "Try me. I have spent years working cattle and breaking horses and dealing with every kind of hardship this land can offer. You are just a bully who beats women. We are not the same." Preston increased the pressure slightly. "So what is it going to be?" For a long moment, nothing. Then James nodded as much as he could with Preston's hand on his throat. Preston released him and stepped back, keeping himself between James and Fiona. James stumbled to his feet, coughing and gasping. His face was already swelling from Preston's fists, blood streaming from his nose. He looked at Fiona with pure venom. "You are not worth this trouble anyway," he spat. "Keep the whore. Keep the bastard child. See how long before he realizes what a mistake he made." "Get out," Preston said quietly. "And if I ever see you near her again, I will not show mercy a second time." James mounted his horse with difficulty and rode off, swaying in the saddle. Preston watched until he disappeared from sight before turning to Fiona, who was crying silently. "Are you all right?" he asked, moving toward her. "Did he hurt you?" She shook her head. "He never made it to the bedroom. I heard voices and hid. But Preston, your shoulder, it is fine," Preston lied, though it was throbbing fiercely now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "Let me get you back inside." That night, after Fiona had reluctantly gone to bed, Preston sat on his porch with his shoulder bound and aching, wondering what he had gotten himself into. He should feel guilty about beating another man, about threatening murder, about sheltering another man's wife. But all he felt was fierce satisfaction that Fiona was safe and that James Chambers was gone. Fiona appeared in the doorway, wrapped in one of Preston's shirts since she had few clothes of her own. "I cannot sleep knowing you are out here in pain because of me." "It was not because of you. It was because of him. Same thing." She sat beside him carefully. "Let me see your shoulder." Preston let her unwrap the bandage and check the bruising, her fingers gentle and sure. Being this close to her, feeling her touch on his bare skin, made something primal stir in him, but he pushed it down. She was pregnant with another man's child, still legally married, and barely recovered from trauma. The last thing she needed was him making things complicated. "You should have let him take me," Fiona said softly. "You should not have risked yourself like that." "I would risk a lot more than a bruised shoulder for you." Preston caught her hand, stilling her movements. "I think I need to be honest with you, Fiona, about how I feel." Preston, please. Let me say this. He took a breath. I know the timing is terrible. I know the situation is complicated, but I am falling in love with you. Maybe I started falling the moment I found you in that storm, or maybe it happened over these past days of getting to know you. But it is happening, and I cannot pretend otherwise. Fiona's eyes shimmered in the moonlight. I am falling in love with you too. I have been trying not to, trying to tell myself it is just gratitude or that I am confused because you saved me. But it is more than that. You make me feel safe and seen and valued in a way I have never experienced before. Then we will figure this out together, Preston said. I do not care what the law says or what people think. You belong with someone who treats you right, and I aim to be that person if you will have me. She kissed him then, soft and tentative at first, then deeper as Preston wrapped his good arm around her and pulled her close. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. I want to be yours, Fiona whispered, in every way that matters. You already are, Preston replied. And I am yours. They decided to leave Abilene. As long as they stayed, there was always a risk that James would return or that the complicated legalities of Fiona's marriage would catch up with them. Preston had heard talk of opportunities further west, places where a man could stake a claim and build a new life, and no one asked too many questions about your past. It took 2 weeks to prepare. Preston sold his property to a neighbor for a fair price and bought a sturdy wagon and supplies for the journey. Fiona's health improved steadily under his care, and though her belly grew rounder with each passing day, Doc Morrison assured them she was strong enough for travel if they took it slow. Martha Morrison cried when they came to say goodbye, pressing preserves and medical supplies into Fiona's hands. You write to us when you are settled, she insisted. Let us know you are all right. We will, Fiona promised, hugging the older woman tight. Thank you for everything. Doc Morrison shook Preston's hand firmly. You are a good man, Xavier. Take care of her and that baby. With my life, Preston said, and meant it. They left Abilene on a crisp October morning, the wagon loaded with everything they owned and hope burning bright in both their hearts. The plan was to head to New Mexico territory, where Preston had heard land was available, and the law was more concerned with Apache raids than marital irregularities. The journey took 3 weeks of slow, careful travel. Preston drove the wagon by day while Fiona rested in the back, and at night they made camp under vast skies full of stars. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, learning each other's habits and preferences, building the foundation of their life together. What should we name the baby? Fiona asked one night as they lay side by side near the fire, proper distance between them but fingers intertwined. Preston had been thinking about this. If it is a girl, I think you should choose, but if it is a boy... He paused. Would you consider letting me give him my father's name, Thomas? He was a good man, and I would like his name to live on. Fiona squeezed his hand. Thomas Xavier, I like that. And if it is a girl, I would like to name her Martha after the woman who showed us such kindness. Martha Xavier, Preston tested the name. Perfect. They encountered a few other travelers on the road, but mostly kept to themselves. Once they passed a small wagon train heading to California, and the trail boss warned them about bandits operating in the area. Preston doubled his vigilance after that, keeping his rifle close and choosing their campsites carefully. It was on their 18th day of travel that Fiona woke Preston in the middle of the night, her voice tight with pain. Something is wrong. I am having contractions. Preston was up instantly, his heart racing. It is too early. You are not due for another month at least. I know. Fiona's face was pale in the moonlight, but the baby is coming regardless. The nearest town was 2 days away, far too long. Preston frantically tried to remember everything Doc Morrison had told him about childbirth, but his mind felt blank with panic. Then Fiona grabbed his hand and looked at him with absolute trust. "You can do this," she said firmly. "We can do this together." Preston took a shaky breath and nodded. He built up the fire for light and heat, boiled water like he had seen Martha do, and gathered the clean cloths and blankets they had packed. Fiona's contractions grew closer together and more intense, and Preston had never felt so helpless in his entire life as he watched her suffer and could do nothing but hold her hand and murmur encouragement. "I am scared," Fiona admitted between contractions, tears streaming down her face. "What if something goes wrong? What if the baby does not survive?" "Then we will face it together," Preston said fiercely. "But that baby is going to be fine, and so are you, because you are the strongest person I have ever met, and this is just one more challenge you are going to overcome." The labor lasted through the night and into the morning. At one point, Fiona squeezed Preston's hand so hard he thought bones might break, but he did not complain. When she was too exhausted to push anymore, he talked her through it, reminding her of all the things they were going to do together, all the life they were going to build. Finally, as the sun rose pink and gold over the desert, a baby's cry split the air. Preston caught the tiny, squirming infant in his hands, overwhelmed with wonder and terror at the fragile life he held. Following instinct and half-remembered instructions, he cleaned the baby's face and cut the cord with his knife, then wrapped the child in soft flannel. "A boy," he said, his voice choked with emotion as he placed the baby in Fiona's arms. "You have a beautiful, healthy son." Fiona cradled the baby against her chest, crying and laughing at the same time. The infant was small, probably because of the early birth, but his lungs were clearly strong as he continued to wail his displeasure at being thrust into the cold world. "Thomas," Fiona whispered, stroking the baby's tiny fist. "Hello, my sweet Thomas." Preston watched them, mother and child, and felt something settle deep in his chest. This was his family now. Not by blood, not by law, but by choice and love and the bonds forged through hardship. He would protect them with everything he had. They stayed camped for 5 days, letting Fiona recover her strength and giving baby Thomas time to adjust to life outside the womb. Preston proved surprisingly competent at infant care, changing cloths and helping Fiona feed the baby and walking him around the campsite when he fussed. Other travelers passed by and offered help or supplies, as was the way of the frontier where survival often depended on the kindness of strangers. When they finally resumed their journey, Preston drove even more carefully than before, hyper-aware of his precious cargo. Thomas proved to be a relatively quiet baby, seeming content as long as he was fed and near his mother. Fiona recovered quickly, her strength returning day by day. They reached the town of Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, in early November. It was a rough settlement, filled with cowboys and miners and the kind of people who came west to escape something or find something or both. Preston inquired about available land and was directed to a man named Samuel Worth, who handled such transactions. Worth was a weathered man in his 50s with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything. He looked at Preston and Fiona and baby Thomas and asked no questions about their history. "Got 160 acres about 6 miles north of here," Worth said, spreading a rough map on his desk. "Previous owner gave up and went back east. There is a small house, needs work, but it is livable. Creek runs through the property. Good grazing land if you are thinking cattle." "How much?" Preston asked. The price was more than fair. Preston paid cash from his carefully hoarded savings and walked out with a deed to their new home. Fiona cried when he showed her the papers, her name written right alongside his as if they were legally married, as if she had every right to it. "Our land," she said wonderingly. "Our home." The house was rough, as Worth had warned, just 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, but it had a solid roof and a good fireplace. Preston spent the first week making repairs and improvements while Fiona cleaned and organized, transforming the bachelor's shack into a home. Thomas slept in a cradle Preston built from scrap wood, his tiny presence filling the house with new purpose. Their nearest neighbors were the Harlow family, homesteaders who had been in the area for 3 years. Mary Harlow was a practical woman who came calling within days of their arrival, bringing fresh bread and welcome advice about surviving in the territory. "You will want to watch for Comanche this time of year," Mary said as she bounced Thomas on her knee. "They mostly stick to themselves these days, but better safe than sorry." "Thank you for the warning," Fiona said. She liked Mary immediately, appreciating the woman's no-nonsense manner and warm smile. "I do not mean to pry," Mary said carefully, "but folks will ask, 'Are you two married?'" Preston and Fiona exchanged glances. "Legally, it is complicated," Preston said finally. "But in every way that matters, yes. She is my wife and Thomas is my son." Mary considered this and nodded. "Good enough for me." "Out here, what matters is how you treat each other and whether you pull your weight. The rest is between you and God." Word spread quickly about the new family on the northern property, and most of their neighbors proved as accepting as Mary. A few raised eyebrows at the situation, a young couple with a newborn, and no wedding ring on Fiona's finger, but most frontier folk had learned not to judge too harshly. Everyone had come from somewhere, running from something or searching for something better. Preston found work helping with the winter cattle operations while also building up their own small herd. He was gone long hours some days, but he always came home to Fiona and Thomas, and that made every moment of hard labor worthwhile. Fiona proved adept at frontier life, tending a vegetable garden and learning to preserve food and managing their modest household with efficiency and grace. Thomas thrived despite his early arrival, growing plump and happy under their combined care. Preston had worried that the boy might not feel like truly his, but those concerns evaporated the first time Thomas smiled at him or grabbed his finger with tiny, trusting hands. Biology meant nothing compared to the fierce love he felt for this child. One evening in late December, as they sat by the fire with Thomas sleeping between them, Fiona broached a subject they had been dancing around for weeks. "Preston, about us, about our marriage or lack thereof." She took a breath. "I want to be married to you, really married. But I do not know how legally. I am still technically married to James." Preston had been thinking about this too. Worth mentioned that the judge who comes through Cimarron is not particular about asking for proof of previous marriages. "Lots of folks out here are starting fresh, leaving complicated pasts behind. We could get married in the eyes of the law, even if there might be questions about the legality. What if James finds us? What if he makes trouble? Then we face it together like we have faced everything else." Preston took her hand. "Fiona, I want to marry you. I want to stand up in front of witnesses and vow to love and protect you for the rest of my life. I want your name to be Xavier, legally and officially. I want Thomas to grow up knowing his parents are truly married." Fiona smiled, tears glistening. "I want that too, more than anything." The judge arrived in January, a portly man named Harrison who held court in the back room of the local saloon. Preston and Fiona appeared before him on a cold, bright morning with Thomas bundled in Fiona's arms and the Harlow family as their witnesses. Judge Harrison asked only basic questions: names, ages, residence, and did not inquire about previous marriages or circumstances. When Preston and Fiona exchanged their vows, speaking words of love and commitment with voices that shook with emotion. There was not a dry eye among the witnesses. "By the power vested in me by the territory of New Mexico," Judge Harrison intoned, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Xavier." Preston cupped Fiona's face gently and kissed her, soft and reverent, sealing their commitment. When they broke apart, Fiona was crying happy tears and Thomas let out a small cry as if adding his blessing to the proceedings. Mary Harlow insisted on hosting a celebration dinner at her home that evening, and a surprising number of neighbors showed up to wish the newlyweds well. There was music and dancing, and the kind of community spirit that made the harsh life of the frontier bearable. Preston danced with his wife for the first time, whirling her around the Harlows' small parlor while Thomas watched from Mary's arms. "Are you happy?" Preston asked as they swayed together. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," Fiona replied honestly. "Sometimes I wake up and have to remind myself this is real, that I really have you and Thomas and our home and our life together. It is real, and it is forever." Preston pulled her closer. "I love you, Fiona Xavier." "I love you too, Preston Xavier. Thank you for finding me in that storm. Thank you for saving us." "You saved me too," Preston said. "I just did not realize I needed saving until I found you." Their first year of marriage was not easy. The frontier demanded constant work and vigilance, and there were setbacks and challenges that tested their resolve. A summer drought threatened their crops and garden. Preston was thrown from a horse and broke 2 ribs, spending weeks in pain while Fiona managed everything alone. Thomas developed a fever that terrified them both, though it eventually broke after 3 agonizing days. But through it all they had each other. When Preston hurt, Fiona nursed him with patient care. When Fiona was exhausted from managing a fussy baby and a household, Preston took over without being asked. They learned each other's strengths and weaknesses, how to fight fair when they disagreed, how to forgive quickly and love generously. Thomas grew from infant to toddler, learning to crawl and then walk, babbling mama and dada with equal enthusiasm. Preston taught him to feed the chickens and check for eggs, while Fiona taught him songs and simple words. The boy had Fiona's dark hair and eyes, but Preston's stubborn chin and broad smile. When Thomas was 2 years old, Fiona discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news brought pure joy without the shadow of fear and violence that had haunted her first pregnancy. Preston was beside himself with excitement, already planning how to expand their house to accommodate a growing family. "This time I want to give you a daughter," Fiona teased as they lay in bed one night, Preston's hand resting on the slight swell of her belly. "I will be happy with whatever God gives us," Preston said honestly. "Another son would be wonderful. A daughter would be a blessing. Healthy is all I care about." But fate gave them a daughter anyway, born on a warm May evening in 1880 with Mary Harlow attending as midwife. Martha Xavier was smaller than Thomas had been but fiercer, announcing her arrival with lusty cries that seemed impossibly loud for someone so tiny. Preston fell in love the moment he saw her, this perfect little girl with wisps of dark hair and her mother's delicate features. Thomas, now old enough to understand he had a sister, was fascinated and wanted to touch her constantly until Fiona had to explain about being gentle. "Our family is complete," Fiona said as she nursed Martha while Thomas played at her feet and Preston sat nearby, his heart so full he thought it might burst. "Perfect," Preston agreed. The years that followed were the happiest of Preston's life. Their ranch grew steadily as he built up their cattle herd and added horses. Thomas proved a natural with animals, following his father everywhere and mimicking his work. Martha was sunshine personified, all laughter and joy, charming everyone she met. Fiona flourished as a wife and mother, her earlier traumas fading to distant memories that rarely haunted her anymore. She started a small business making preserves and baked goods that she sold in town, contributing to their income and taking pride in her work. Preston marveled at her transformation from the frightened, bleeding woman he had found in the mud to this confident, vibrant person who ran their household and business with equal competence. They heard news occasionally from travelers about happenings in Texas. James Chambers' name never came up, and Fiona stopped jumping at every unexpected visitor. Whether he had moved on or met some frontier justice, they never knew and did not particularly care. That chapter of Fiona's life was closed, and she had no desire to reopen it. In 1883, when Thomas was 5 and Martha 3, Fiona discovered she was pregnant again. This time it was twins, 2 boys born healthy and howling in the middle of winter. They named them Daniel and David, and suddenly their 2-room house seemed impossibly small despite the additions Preston had made over the years. "We need to build bigger," Preston said, looking around at the chaos of 4 children under 6. "Or we need to stop having babies," Fiona replied with a laugh, though her eyes were warm with love as she nursed the twins. They built bigger. With help from neighbors, Preston constructed a proper house with 4 bedrooms and a real kitchen and a parlor. It took all summer, and when it was finished, Fiona cried at the sight of her beautiful home with glass windows and wooden floors. "Remember that shack we started in?" she said to Preston as they stood in their new parlor. "I remember everything," Preston replied, pulling her close. "I remember finding you in that storm and being terrified you would die. I remember the first time you smiled at me, really smiled. I remember delivering Thomas and thinking my heart might explode. I remember our wedding and every single day since." "What a life we have built," Fiona marveled. "What a life we are still building," Preston corrected. "We have decades ahead of us still, God willing." And indeed they did. The years continued to unfold with the steady rhythm of frontier life. Thomas grew into a serious young man who shared his father's love of ranching and was talking about staking his own claim one day. Martha was bright and curious, learning to read at a young age and always asking questions about everything. The twins were terrors, constantly getting into mischief, but impossible not to love with their matching grins and endless energy. In 1889, 11 years after that fateful storm in Abilene, Preston and Fiona sat on the porch of their home watching the sun set over land they had tamed with their own hands. Their children were inside, the older ones helping prepare supper while the twins chased each other around. "Do you ever regret it?" Fiona asked quietly. Taking in a pregnant stranger with nothing but trouble following her, Preston looked at his wife, this woman he had loved for over a decade, whose strength and grace continued to amaze him daily. "Not for one single moment. Even when James kicked me, even though I was carrying another man's child. Thomas is my son in every way that matters. And that night, when I found you bleeding and frightened in the mud, it was the beginning of my real life. Everything before was just waiting." Preston took her hand, his thumb rubbing the simple gold band he had bought her on their 5th anniversary. "You gave me purpose, Fiona. You gave me a reason to build something permanent instead of just drifting from cattle drive to cattle drive. You gave me a family and a home and love that fills every corner of my life. You saved me," Fiona said simply. "In every possible way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," Preston corrected, "and we will keep saving each other every day for the rest of our lives." The storm that had brought them together was long past, but the love that bloomed from that desperate moment had only grown stronger with time. As the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Preston Xavier and Fiona Xavier sat hand in hand, their children's laughter drifting through the open windows, grateful for the chance encounter that had changed everything. Years continued to pass in steady succession, each one adding new layers to their story. Thomas married at 21, a sweet girl from town named Rebecca, and built his own homestead adjacent to his parents' land. Martha became a teacher in Cimarron, one of the first women in the territory to pursue such a profession, making her mother fiercely proud. The twins, Daniel and David, eventually stopped finishing each other's sentences long enough to develop their own distinct personalities. Daniel the dreamer who loved horses, and David the practical one who had a head for business. Preston expanded their ranch until it was one of the most successful in the region, but he never forgot the lean early years when every penny mattered. He was known as a fair employer and a generous neighbor, quick to help those who needed it just as others had helped him when he was starting out. Fiona became something of a community leader, organizing social events and helping new families settle in the area. She particularly made it her mission to help women in difficult situations, remembering all too well what it felt like to be trapped and afraid. More than one woman arrived in Cimarron fleeing violence or hardship, and found sanctuary and support through Fiona's quiet intervention. In 1895, when Preston was 41 and Fiona 37, they became grandparents for the first time when Thomas and Rebecca welcomed a daughter. Preston held the tiny infant with the same wonder he had felt holding Thomas all those years ago, marveling at the continuation of legacy and love. "What did you name her?" he asked Thomas. "Grace," his son replied. "Because we believe in grace, in second chances, in the kind of love that heals instead of hurts. You taught me that, Pa. You and Ma both." Preston looked at Fiona across the room and saw tears in her eyes that matched his own. The scared young woman he had carried through a storm had become the foundation of a family built on love and respect, and the simple truth that people could change their destinies through choice and courage. They threw a party for their 20th wedding anniversary in 1896, though of course it was actually their 18th if you counted from the storm, but they had decided years ago to mark from their official wedding date. The celebration was held at their ranch, and it seemed like half the territory showed up. There was music and dancing and a feast that took days to prepare. "Speech," someone called out, and the crowd took up the chant. "Speech, speech." Preston stood reluctantly, uncomfortable with attention, but Fiona squeezed his hand encouragingly. He looked out at the assembled crowd, neighbors and friends, their children and grandchild, all the people who had become part of their extended family. "I am not much for speeches," Preston began, and good-natured laughter rippled through the crowd. "But I do want to say that 20 years ago, I made the best decision of my life when I married this woman. She has made me better in every way possible. She has given me children I am proud of, a home I love coming back to, and a reason to get up every morning and work hard to build something lasting." He turned to Fiona, speaking directly to her now while everyone else faded to background. "You are my heart, Fiona. You always have been, from that first moment in the storm. I love you more today than I did 20 years ago, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for building this life with me." There was not a dry eye anywhere as Preston kissed his wife to enthusiastic applause. Later, as they danced together while musicians played and their grandchildren ran underfoot, Fiona rested her head against Preston's shoulder and sighed contentedly. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" she asked. "When I asked why you were helping me?" "I said my mother raised me to help people who needed it," Preston replied. You also said that maybe we were supposed to meet exactly when and how we did, Fiona reminded him. That it felt like walking away would be walking away from something important. Best instinct I ever followed. Mine too. When I grabbed your wrist and asked you to stay with me at the doctor's office, I barely knew you, but something in me recognized something in you, just like you said. Soul recognizing soul. Preston held her tighter. Soul recognizing soul, he repeated. I like that. As the evening wound down and guests departed, Preston and Fiona stood on their porch watching the stars emerge one by one. Thomas was settling Grace in a corner while Martha helped clean up, and the twins argued good-naturedly about something inconsequential. This was their legacy, not just the land or the house or the successful ranch, but this family, these connections, this love that had started with a desperate rescue in a storm and grown into something beautiful and enduring. The years continued their steady march forward. Preston's hair turned gray at the temples, then went completely silver. Fiona developed laugh lines around her eyes that Preston thought made her even more beautiful. They watched their children grow into capable adults with families of their own, and their grandchildren multiplied until Preston lost count of how many there were. Through it all, their love remained the constant. They still sat on their porch in the evenings, still held hands, still talked for hours about everything and nothing. They weathered droughts and economic downturns, celebrated births and mourned deaths, saw the frontier gradually become less wild and more settled. In 1903, when Preston was 49 and Fiona 45, they decided to travel back to Texas for the first time since they had left. The children were all grown, the ranch was in capable hands, and they wanted to see how the places of their past had changed. Abilene was bigger than they remembered, with actual paved streets and electric lights in some buildings. Doc Morrison had passed away 5 years earlier, but Martha was still alive, nearly 80 now and sharp as ever. I knew you two would make it, Martha said as she served them tea in her parlor. From the moment I saw how that young man looked at you, Fiona, I knew you had found something special. We have been blessed, Fiona agreed. More than I ever dreamed possible. You made your own blessings, Martha corrected gently. Through choice and courage and love. That is not luck, dear. That is character. They visited Preston's childhood home, now owned by strangers, and the small cemetery where his parents were buried. Fiona stood beside him as he paid his respects, her presence a comfort as always. I wish they could have met you, Preston said quietly. My mother especially. She would have loved you. I wish I could have known them, Fiona replied. Anyone who raised a son like you must have been remarkable people. They returned to New Mexico after 2 weeks, both relieved to be home. Texas was where they had come from, but New Mexico was where they had built their life together, and it would always be home. The decades rolled on with increasing speed, as time always seems to do as one ages. Preston and Fiona moved through middle age with grace, their love deepening with each passing year. They celebrated their 30th anniversary, then their 40th, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren. In 1918, when Preston was 64 and Fiona 60, the Spanish flu swept through the territory. They lost friends and neighbors, saw whole families devastated. Preston fell ill, and for 3 terrifying weeks, Fiona nursed him while fearing she might lose the man who had been her whole world for 40 years. You have to fight, she told him during his worst nights, her voice fierce even as tears streamed down her face. You promised me forever, Preston Xavier, and I am holding you to that promise. Preston survived, though he was weaker afterward, aged in a way that had nothing to do with years. But he was alive, and that was all that mattered to Fiona. On a warm spring evening in 1923, 45 years after that storm in Abilene, Preston and Fiona sat on their porch watching another sunset. They were both in their late 60s now, their children all successful in their own right, their grandchildren numbering in the dozens, their great-grandchildren just beginning to arrive. "I have been thinking," Preston said slowly, "about legacy, about what we leave behind when we are gone." "Morbid thoughts for such a beautiful evening," Fiona chided gently, though she knew where this was coming from. Several of their friends had passed recently, and mortality was increasingly on both their minds. Not morbid, just realistic. Preston took her hand, his grip still strong despite his age. "I want you to know that my life has been everything I could have hoped for and more. That storm that brought you to me was the best thing that ever happened to me." "The best thing that ever happened to both of us," Fiona corrected. "You saved my life, Preston. You gave me Thomas, even though he was not yours by blood. You gave me Martha and Daniel and David. You gave me decades of love and partnership and joy. You made me believe in goodness again when I thought the world had none left to offer." "We saved each other," Preston said, echoing words he had spoken decades earlier. "And we built something beautiful together. Look at all of this." He gestured broadly at the ranch, at the house, at the land that stretched to the horizon. "This is our legacy. Not just the property, but the family, the love, the way we treated people and lived our lives." "I have no regrets," Fiona said softly. "Not a single one. Even the hard times, even the pain, it was all worth it because I had you beside me." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared and the stars emerged. Two people who had found each other against impossible odds and built a life that would echo through generations. Their story had started with blood and fear and a desperate rescue in a storm, but it had become something transcendent, a testament to the power of love, choice, and the courage to claim your own destiny. Preston Xavier passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1926 at the age of 72, with Fiona holding his hand. He had lived to see his children thrive, his grandchildren grow, and his great-grandchildren born. The funeral drew hundreds of people, a testament to the impact he had made during his years in New Mexico. Fiona lived another 8 years, surrounded by family, tended by children who loved her and grandchildren who revered her. She spent her final years telling stories of the early days, of the storm and the rescue, of building a life from nothing with a man who had seen her at her worst and loved her anyway. When Fiona Xavier passed away in 1934 at the age of 76, she was buried beside Preston on a hill overlooking their ranch. Their children erected a simple stone marker that read, "Preston and Fiona Xavier, united by storm, bound by love together forever." And in the decades that followed, as their descendants spread across the territory and beyond, the story of how they met was passed down through generations, a reminder that love could bloom in the darkest moments, that strangers could become soulmates, and that sometimes the greatest love stories started with a simple choice to help someone in need. The ranch remained in the family, passed down through Thomas's line, and every generation that worked that land knew the story of their ancestors. They knew about the pregnant woman bleeding in the mud and the young cowboy who carried her gently through the storm. They knew about the choice Preston made to save Fiona and the choice Fiona made to trust him. They knew about the courage it took to build a life together when the world said it was impossible. And on clear nights, when the descendants of Preston and Fiona Xavier gathered on that same porch to watch the sunset over land their ancestors had tamed, they could feel it, the presence of that enduring love, the legacy of two people who had chosen each other against all odds and built something beautiful that would last long after they were gone. The storm had passed over a century ago, but its effects rippled forward through time in the form of children and grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren who existed because one man had stopped to help one woman in her darkest hour. Because Preston had carried Fiona through that storm with gentleness and care. Because they had both been brave enough to reach for love when it was offered, to build a family from ashes and hope and sheer determination. Their story became legend in the family, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But at its heart remained a simple truth. That love, real love, the kind that lasts, is built not just in moments of passion but in quiet acts of kindness, in choosing each other day after day, in believing that together you can weather any storm. And so the legacy of Preston and Fiona Xavier lived on, not just in the land they had tamed or the wealth they had built, but in the enduring truth that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is simply one person choosing to help another, one soul recognizing another across the chaos, and two hearts deciding that together they could build something that would last forever.